In this video, I'm going to be taking you through an in-depth tutorial on the Sega Model 3 emulator, Supermodel. Supermodel, being based in command line, can be a little bit tricky to use. So we're going to be using the UI today, and I'm also going to be providing pre-configurations for your controllers. Supermodel, unfortunately, isn't one of those emulators where you can just press a couple of buttons and get everything up and running with no issues. We do need to put in a little bit of effort. The main focus of this video is to consolidate as much information as possible. So by the end of the video, you should have all of your controls set up and all of these games running with little to no issues. So without further ado, let's get into it. To download Supermodel, you can go direct to the Supermodel website. However, I do prefer to use this website here, emucr.com. When you hit the home page, you want to come down to this search function here and search for Supermodel Git and press search. These results are not going to be in chronological order, so you're going to have to double check the release dates to make sure that you're getting the most recent one. Supermodel used to release under their SVNR numbers, with their last commit using this being SVNR888. They have moved everything over to Git, so make sure you do not download any of the older versions. As of recording this video, this is the most recent version of Supermodel, so just click there and download that from the link here. Once you've got that downloaded, you want to bring yourself back down to the search function and search for Sega Model 3 UI. Again, these are not going to be in chronological order, and as of recording this video, this is the most recent release. So just click on that and then just select where you want to download that from these links here. Once you've got both of those downloaded, you're going to want to unzip them, and now we want to transfer some files from the Sega Model 3 UI folder into the Supermodel folder. So it's going to open up my Supermodel folder on the left and the UI folder on the right. Now we want to transfer the include folder, the snaps folder, and the UI exe. Only transfer those three files. Do not transfer any of these other files at all. All you need to do to start the Sega Model 3 UI is just double click on it, and here it is. Now the first thing that we want to do is to point Supermodel to where our ROMs are located. I do recommend using the ROMs folder within the Supermodel file system itself, as it just keeps everything neat and tidy. To set your ROMs location, you just come down to this folder button here in the bottom left hand corner, click that, select the ROMs file where your ROMs are located and click OK. In the past, MAME did not contain the correct ROM files Supermodel was expecting within its zips. You would have needed to create your own custom zip with the correct ROM files, or have found a set online for your specific version, as Supermodel would again change what files it required on a per release basis. But now we do not need to do that dance anymore. Thanks to updates to Supermodel, it has now synced up with MAME. This makes things a hell of a lot easier for everyone. However, you can't just use any MAME ROM. You must use a split or a non-merged ROM. Make sure these are from as recent MAME set as possible. I tested back to 0.236 with everything still working. The further you go back, the less likely those zips are to contain the required files. If you were to use a merged ROM, you'd get some strange behaviour from Supermodel, as it's not expecting merged ROMs. If you're using a non-merged ROM, these should contain all the files that Supermodel is expecting. However, if you're using a split ROM, these will be missing the optional additional files. But because they're optional, these games will still run just fine without them. If a game is missing a file, Supermodel will tell you in its command window upon startup of a game, or in its log file when you close a game down, which is right here. So let's just use Fighting Vipers 2 as an example. There we go. And we can see that it's this file that's missing, this EPR IC2 file. It's telling us that it's an optional ROM and it's the drive board program. A full list of every single ROM file a game needs in its zip can be found in the game's XML. So it's these files here that are the required files, and you can see this one at the bottom, the drive board program, and it says required false, meaning that it's an optional file. If you are using a split set and you do want to add those optional files yourself, Dirt Devils and Emergency Call Ambulance share the same missing bin file, which can be found in the SCUD zip, which you may already have. Le Mans 24's missing optional file can be found in the STCC zip of MAME. And now Fighting Vipers 2, Virtua Fighter 3, Virtua On 2, and all of the virtual strikers have the same missing optional file, which is in the Sega build BIOS file of main. Just remember, you only need to add those to the parent zips. So, being a one game, one ROM kind of guy, this is the set that I recommend. Now let's go over the video settings. All of the settings that you see on screen here are the settings that I absolutely recommend, apart from your resolution. You might have a different resolution screen, so just set that accordingly. Now do keep in mind, this resolution will be how it appears in windowed mode also. So if you have full screen turned off and you launch a game, it will just still be at this resolution. This only has an effect on the show frame rate because it appears in the window information bar at the top around about here. So if I have this resolution with full screen deactivated, I still won't be able to see my show frame rate. I'd need to set a resolution smaller than my screen to be able to see it. If you have VSync deactivated, Supermodel will run fast. Quad rendering you also want to keep active, as this is how the original hardware used to behave. GPU multi-threaded and multi-threaded, keep those active. I've tried using Supermodel without these on and it does run slowly. Multi-texture, I'm not actually 100% certain what that does. Now widescreen is essentially widescreen hacks. Now it doesn't stretch the image into the 16:9 space, it actually renders everything correctly so you get a true anamorphic image. I absolutely love the widescreen feature on this emulator and it works with pretty much every game. The only two games it doesn't really work very well with is Sega Bass Fishing and Virtua Striker 2, as those games have quite a bit of pop in. You do need to make sure that a widescreen resolution is set for the widescreen hack to work. Wide background is used at the same time as the widescreen hack. Some games, for example Virtua Fighter 3, use an image for its background. So because of the way the widescreen hack works and it's not a polygon, it won't actually be stretched into the widescreen space. So just make sure you enable wide background just to make sure you don't get any black bars next to any backgrounds. With the stretch function, that just simply stretches the 4:3 image into whatever resolution that you set. You need to make sure that widescreen and wide background are deactivated to use this. PowerPC frequency at the bottom determines the megahertz in which the single core CPU will be emulated at. So the default is 49 and most games do just run fine at 49, apart from Sega Rally 2. This will have a lot of graphical glitches and run slowly. So we need to up the PowerPC frequency, and that's what I've done here. But if we go too high, we'll have the adverse effect and we'll slow the emulator down. But if we don't go high enough, Sega Rally will still have graphical glitches. So the sweet spot that I found is 69, and that has no adverse effects on any other games. So here is what it looks like set at 49. And now 69, and you can see that it fixes it right up. Let's move on to the sound tab. Now we want to keep emulate sound on, as we want to emulate the sound. Flip stereo just flips the left and the right channels. You might be a stickler for that kind of thing, but it doesn't really bother me if this is on or off. And emulate DSB, which is digital soundboard, we want to keep enabled as well. The audio for a lot of these games is going to be incorrect. So the music might be really loud, but the sound effects really quiet, or vice versa. So we have these three sliders here. So we've got a music volume slider, a sound volume slider. Now it's not always sound effects, it can be some musical effects as well. And then we have this balance slider in the middle. Now this doesn't change your left and right channels, it balances between the music and the sound. So in some games, just changing the balance will fix the audio. Other games you might need to change the music and the sound volume. And in other games you might even need to change all three to get optimum audio. I'm in the process of going through each game and getting everything balanced correctly, but that's going to take a little while and is a video for another day. But for the moment, you're going to want to keep everything here default, as you really only want to save audio settings on a per game basis. So if we go into the config folder and access our ini file, we have instructions on how to do that just here. I am going to be going in depth on how to do that a little bit later on in the video, but for the moment I just want to show you what it says about the legacy DSP, which is this option here. So legacy DSP implementation for games that do not play well with the newer one, for example Fighting Vipers 2. So I want to make sure this is off by default and activate it on a per game basis. Before we move on to setting our controls, which is a whole nother separate subject, now seems a good time to mention about the Sega Model 3 UI. Now it's a third-party piece of software and it's not actually officially supported by the Supermodel team. And it can actually only take you so far, as Supermodel has a bunch more options that are not in the UI. For example, something that's been added to the ini file as of recent is the refresh rate, and there is no option for that in the UI because there's been no update to it for, I think, just over a year. So you cannot rely upon the UI to get everything that you need set up. So now that I've introduced you to the ini file, get used to it because we're going to be using it from here. Like I say, beyond using this for our initial setup and using it as a launcher, we have now moved beyond that. Do keep in mind that Supermodel saves its changes to the ini file when a game is launched or when it's closed down. Not all of Supermodel's adjustable options will appear in the ini file by default. For example, the sound, music and balance options didn't appear in my ini file until I adjusted those in the UI. So if you calibrate something or you adjust something, the entry should then appear in the ini file. However, you can always add these to the ini file yourself, and a full list of what is adjustable is in section 13 of the README file. Now let's move on to the fabled controls section and how to get everything set up. So we're just going to click on the control tab here. Now by default, Supermodel's controls are a little bit unintuitive to say the least. Things like accelerate and brake are up on the left stick and down on the left stick, not on the triggers where you want them. So the first thing that we need to do is select our input system. If you've got an X input controller, select X input. If you've got a D input, select D input. We also want to activate the force feedback. This only works for 4 games. So both versions of Daytona USA 2, Scud Race and Sega Rally 2. This is generally used for force feedback steering wheels. However, if you have a controller that vibrates, activating force feedback will activate that function for those 4 games. You also want to make sure that force feedback is enabled, otherwise you'll get this error message in Ski Champ and this error message in Star Wars Trilogy Arcade. So just make sure that you've got force feedback enabled all the time just to avoid those error messages. You also want to make sure that your crosshairs are active. You've got 3 choices, player 1 only, player 2 only, or both players at the same time. I'm just going to select player 1. Now this is only really needed for the Lost World, as all the other light gun games, LA Machine Guns, The Ocean Hunter and Star Wars Trilogy Arcade, even though it's only kind of a light gun game, these all have their own in-game crosshairs. After we've done that, we actually need to close down the UI and restart it, just to ensure all of those changes we just made are saved to the ini file. You also want to make a copy of your ini file. There we go. And that's just for backup and in case something goes wrong during the configuration process. There are 2 ways to remap your controls. You can use the remapping tool by pressing this config button here. However, I'm not a big fan of using this and I don't think that I'm the only one. It's very clunky to use, there's loads of pitfalls, and apart from anything else, if you save an input using this tool, it changes your ini file around as well. So the before is on the left and the after is on the right. So you can see that it's taken away the quick overview, and more importantly, it's taken away the categorizations for the inputs. So this kind of information here, where I get a list of games that use these inputs, this prevents me from setting clashing inputs. I only ever use the remapping tool to find out what my input tags are, so these things here. However, you do not need to worry about that at all, because I'm providing pre-configurations for both X input controllers and D input controllers. These are up over on the Launchbox forums. I will be providing links for these in the description below. And make sure that you go to your respective input system, as the input tag IDs are different for both. So for the moment, we're just going to scroll down and ignore what's at the top of the page here until we get to the pre-configured inputs for Supermodel. And here we go. This is the input section of my ini file with absolutely everything pre-configured for X input and D input controllers. All you need to do is just copy and paste this into your ini file. So we're just going to the config folder and open up the ini file. And then we're going to scroll down to where it says comment. There we go. And then we're just going to copy all of this. There we go. Make sure you don't catch anything at the bottom of the page. So Control C, and then we're going to select all of this. And we're going to make sure that we do not overwrite any of our other options. So make sure you stop there just above crosshairs, paste that in. I'm just going to double check that took, yep, and then give that a save. And that should be all of your controls pre-configured. We also want to add a dead zone to our controller. So if we scroll back up the page to where it says adding a dead zone, just there, and we want to copy and paste this into our ini files. This makes racing games a little less twitchy, and it also stops clashing inputs when using a controller and a mouse for light gun games. So we want to paste this just underneath our input system, just there, and I've done that for both controllers. Just make sure that any changes that you make to your ini file, you save it. I've spent quite a few hours figuring out what the best configuration is for these games, and to find out what I've set, if you go to the top of the page here, you will find a list of every single input for your controller along with its Supermodel input ID tag. So say for example you want to find out what your punch button is, you can see that's Joy 1 button 3, and on our list here we can see that's the X button on an Xbox controller. A few things to note about how I've remapped these controls. With the common inputs, I've made sure that the service and the test buttons are not on the controller, as you don't want to be pressing those in game. And I've made sure that I've kept the default keyboard inputs for these inputs, because these come in handy for when we're going through our test menus. With the 4-way digital joysticks, I've set this to the D-pad and the left stick. So with games that use this, for instance the fighting games, you've got the choice between the two in game. Now, all but one game do not have clashing inputs. The one game that does have clashing inputs is Sega Rally 2. Now, because the 4-speed manual transmission are on the face buttons here, that means there is no space for the view change or the handbrake, and I want these to be on the face buttons. So as a compromise, you would need to play this game with automatic transmission. Alternatively, you can remove these to say none and just use the up and down shifter. Do keep in mind that if you do change these to none, you're also doing that for Daytona 2 and Scud Race. So you would need to use the up and down shifter for those two games as well. With Star Wars Trilogy, during its bonus stages, which are the lightsaber battles, it actually inverts the Y-axis. So as a compromise, I'll just use the mouse for all the shooting sections, and when I get to a lightsaber battle, I'll pick up my controller because I've inverted the Y-axis for just the controller. If you do want to change some of these controls around, I recommend only changing the button inputs. If it's a directional input, you do not need to touch it. This is because left is left and right is right, except in the case of Star Wars Trilogy, so you really shouldn't need to touch those. So if you see any inputs like the axes, the D-pad, or the left stick or the right stick, just leave it. So there's how to use my pre-configuration and then edit it if you wish to do so. Now, because X input controllers are identical, all of the input IDs and this list here are going to be the same for absolutely everyone who is using an X input controller. However, the same cannot be said for DINPUT controllers. I've used a PlayStation 4 controller to make this pre-configuration, as it's one of the most common DINPUT controllers. However, when I used my 8-bit DOE controller, it didn't actually line up with these inputs. The input ID tags were completely different. But then when I tested it with an ultra crappy third-party controller, all of these input ID tags were identical. So your mileage may vary depending on the controller that you have. So test out a few games, see if the inputs are fine. I would recommend starting up a racing game, see if you can coin it up with select and start it with start, and use the trigger buttons for accelerate and brake. And if you can use those, you're pretty much good to go. However, if any of those inputs do not work, or you notice any inputs don't line up, we now need to find out what your input ID tags are for your specific controller. So essentially, I'm going to be showing you how to make your own input list like I've made here, but for your specific controller. If all of your inputs are fine, then feel free to skip the next section and move on to the test menu stuff. So if you're using a DINPUT controller that isn't a PS4 controller and you're finding that your inputs are not lining up, we need to find out what your input tags are for your specific controller. DINPUT controllers come in all shapes and sizes. This pre-configuration is geared towards a twin stick configuration. So keeping everything as simple as possible, all you need to do is create a new text document in Supermodel and name that to your controller. I've got an 8-bit DOE Pro 2 controller. And then you just want to open that up. Then you want to come down on the Launchbox page, and we just want to copy and paste the input list just here. There we go, Control C, and we want to put that in the document that we just created and give that a little save. Now we want to open up Supermodel and go into the remapping tool. So we want to go to the Control tab and press this config button here. You just want to move the remapping tool over to one side and bring up the document that we just created. Now we are only using the remapping tool to find out what our input tags are. We are not saving using Q and saving all changes. We don't want to do that. And we're actually going to be ignoring what it's asking us to input here. We only want to find out what our inputs are for our list on the left hand side there. So I'm just going to make sure I've got my remapping tool selected, and I'm just going to press enter. Now when it says setting, it means that it's ready to receive an input. So completely ignoring what it's asking us to input here, we're just going to press square on our controllers instead. And we can see that on my controller, my 8-bit DO controller, that's joy on button 5. And on a PS4 controller, it's actually joy on button 1. So I'm just going to change that one to a 5, nice and easy. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that for X, circle and triangle. So enter X, enter circle, enter triangle. So we can see that X is joy on button 2 and it's the same on a PS4 controller. So some inputs might be the same between controllers. And we can see that the circle button is button 1, so we need to change that to button 1. And the triangle button is also the same on a PS4 controller. So let's just do that for L1 and R1. So enter L1, enter R1, and that's button 7 and 8. So change that 5 to a 7, and that's 6 to an 8. Now with your shoulder buttons, these can either show up as an analog input or a digital input. Or in the case of a PS4 controller, it actually shows up as both. So let's see what it shows up on my controller. Just press enter and then L2. There we go. It actually doesn't show up as an analog input at all. So let's just delete that out of there, make my life a little bit easier. There we go, and change that 8 to a 9. So I already know that R2 is going to be button 10 with no analog input. There we are. Now let's do select start L3 and R3. So enter select, enter start, enter L3, enter R3. So select is 11, start is 12, L3 is 14, and R3 is 15. So we actually want to stop there, as if you're using a twin stick configuration controller, all of these inputs here should be exactly the same between controllers. So you can just go up to File and hit Save, and then we want to close down the remapping tool as we don't want to save any changes. From here, all you need to do is just bring up your ini file side by side the input list we've just made. Now because we now have a full input list, editing the input section of our ini file is super easy. So just to give you a few examples of how I do this. So the start button on my 8-bit DO controller is button 12, but on a PS4 controller is button 10. So I'm just going to change that 10 to a 12, and I'll do that for both controllers, as you can't mix and match DINPUT and X input controllers. Now let's do the same for the select button. I want that to be my coin button. It's button 11, not button 9. There we go. So I think you get the point here, or you just take yourself through the list, changing these as you go. If you're using a twin stick configuration controller, there are some inputs that you do not need to touch at all or worry about. So as I mentioned earlier, the directional inputs are the same between controllers. So if you see any of these inputs in the ini file, you don't need to change them. An easy way to spot them, if you see POV in an input, you don't need to touch it, and if you see axis in an input, you also don't need to touch it, except for the trigger buttons. Now these are the analog variants for the trigger buttons, but on my controller, and it might be the same for yours as well, they only showed up as a digital input. So I would need to swap these out for the digital input variants. So L2 I would just swap out for my brake there. There we go. And R2 I would just swap out for the accelerator. And that's just because I don't have those analog variants. If you do, you don't need to touch those at all. So you would want to do that for the accelerator and the brake, and there's only two other inputs that I'd set for an analog input, and that is the fishing reel for Sega bass fishing and also the tension. So it's only those four inputs that you'd need to change if you have a digital variant. For every other game that uses L2 and R2, for instance Virtual On, for its shot buttons, you can see that I've used the digital variant. So that's everything you should need to get your controls configured if my pre-configuration didn't work for you. So after you've got all of your controls sorted out, we can now move on to sorting out the test menus. Quite a few of these games will not run unless we get them fixed in their test menus. So we're going to be using our test and service buttons. By default on your keyboards, test should be 6 and service should be 5. Test is what gets us into the test menus and what we use for our select button, and service is what we use to navigate through the menus. We're going to start with the network board not present issue, and this issue happens with both versions of Daytona, Scud Race Plus, and the DX version of Sega Rally 2. So I'm going to show you how to do that with Daytona USA 2, but the same method applies to all of those games. And there you can see network board not present. So from here you want to press test, whatever you set that to, but it should be 6 by default on your keyboard. You might need to press that a couple of times. And then to scroll through this menu you want to press service, which should be 5 on your keyboard by default. So do that one input at a time until you get to game assignments, and then press test on it. Now we want to change the link ID to single because it's not a master in a link of machines. So you press that once, twice, 3 times until it says single. Then we want to scroll down with service down to exit, press test on exit, scroll down to exit again. Make sure you don't overshoot it and press exit again. Dirt Devils has an issue where it will oversteer like crazy unless we calibrate it in the test menu. So I'm just going to start the game up. So as you can see here, I can pretty much turn my wheels to the point where they're turning back on themselves. And they're not meant to do that. So we're just going to press test. That should be 6 on your keyboards or whatever you've set it to. And then we're going to use service to go to calibrate control device. Press test on that. Then go up to calibrate steering and press test on it. And then we want to follow the instructions on the screen. So we're going to turn the steering wheel, so our stick, all the way to the right and all the way to the left. Then we're going to let go of it and press test again. And then it says set steering in center position and press test. So don't touch the stick and press test again. And there we go, that's your steering calibrated. However, we do need to calibrate the gas and the brake here. So I'm just going to press service once to go down to gas, press test on it. Then I'm going to press on my right trigger, let go of it and press test again. And that's the gas calibrated. So press service to go down to brake, press test, press your left trigger, let go of it and press test again. And that's all of the controls calibrated. So just go down to exit, go down to exit again. And now you can see our steering is far more reasonable and what it should be. There we go. LA Machine Guns has an issue where you won't be able to move the cursor around in game until it's calibrated in its test menu. So I'm just going to start the game up. I'm moving my mouse around and nothing is happening. So we need to press our test buttons. And then we need to press our service buttons down to down to aim set rather. And we want to press test on this. Now this is the calibration screen. Now here we actually need to click our left mouse button and then move our invisible cursor into all 4 corners of the screen. So you can see one player X and Y max and min values, they need to be 255 and 0. Once you have everything like that, you want to press the test button, scroll down to exit and press the test button on that. And now my cursor is moving in game. Awesome. The Lost World will be inaccurate unless we go in and calibrate it in its test menu. Before we do that, we just want to make sure that our crosshairs is enabled for at least player 1 and then start the game. As you can see, the in-game cursor and the Supermodel cursor are not lining up. So we need to press test to go into the test menu, and then we want to scroll with service down to gun setting. Press test on that. Scroll with service to gun adjustment and press test on that. And here is the calibration screen. Looks a little bit complicated, but it's actually pretty straightforward. So if I press start, that should be 1 on your keyboard by default or whatever you have it set to. You can see that we're actually scrolling through this list here. So if I've right selected, it means that I need to be shooting at this right target here. If I've left selected, it means I need to be shooting at the left target, so on and so forth. I recommend that we start at the center one, so make sure you have center selected. And you want to left click right in the middle using the red cursor. There we go. Then you want to press 1 to move to the right. And there we go. Click over there. Press 1 again to move to the left one. Press 1 again to move to the top. Press 1 again to move to the bottom. Click there. And there we go. We're all lined up. So after you've done that, you just want to press test. Scroll down to exit with service. Press test on that. Scroll down to exit again. press test on that. And you can see we're all lined up in game as well. Awesome. Sega Rally 2 suffers from a bug where if you exit the game with credits still loaded, on your next startup of the game, it might not display any graphics. So to mitigate this, we need to set it to free play. So we're just going to start the game. As soon as the game starts, you can hit your test button, which should be 6 on your keyboards or whatever you set it to. And then we want to go to coin assignments with our service buttons. We want to press test on that. And then we want to change our coin credit setting to number 27. So scroll up to it and then press test on it until we get to number 27. There we go. Then scroll down to exit, press test on that. Go down to exit again and press test on that. And you can see here we're now running in free play mode. We need to do 2 things to Star Wars Trilogy Arcade in its test menu. It suffers from the same issue as Sega Rally 2, so we need to set this one to free play, and we also need to disable the feedback lever. Now if you have force feedback unchecked and you try to play this game, it will actually give you an error message preventing you from playing the game. This is the message that you'll get on startup, and if you have force feedback disabled, this will eventually turn into an error message. But if we disable the feedback lever entirely in this game, we won't even get that message at all. So after the game starts up, we want to press test, which should be 6 on our keyboards or whatever you've set it to. And then we want to use service to go down to coin assignments. We're going to set this one to free play first. Then just scroll with service down to coin credit setting. Press test on this until it says number 27. There we go, free play, and then scroll down with service and hit test on exit. Now we want to scroll down to game assignments, press test on that. And then we want to scroll down to the feedback lever and press 6 on it so it says disable. And then just scroll down to exit, press test on that, and scroll down to exit again and press test on that. And as you can see here, no message on startup and we're in free play mode. For quite a few of these games, you may have noticed that there's only a Japanese ROM available. And when playing these games, there's either a mixture of Japanese and English or just Japanese. And then when you go into the test menus of these games, there's similarly no way to change the region to USA or Europe to allow for English text. However, you can actually do so. If you go to section 10 in the README file, you will find a list of engineers codes for use in the test menus to be able to change the region to USA or Europe, which then changes the text to English. So I'm just going to use the Lost World as an example because its engineers code is pretty easy to remember. So that's start, service test. So I'm just going to start the game up. As you can see here, the game's tutorial is in Japanese text. So we're just going to go into the test menu by pressing test. And then now we want to press the following sequence of inputs like a cheat code. So it was start, service, test. There we go. We're now in the secret country select screen. So I'm just going to press service to scroll through what's available. So we've got USA, export, and Australia. So I'm going to set this to USA because winners don't do drugs. Just press test again to exit. And now the tutorial is in English text, as is all of the text for the rest of the game. Any changes that you make to a game in its test menu will be saved in its NVRAM file, which is in the NVRAM folder. And these files are named to your ROM files. So if you make a mistake or you break a game or you get the issue with Sega Rally 2 and Star Wars Trilogy where it doesn't display any graphics, you can just delete the NVRAM file here. I'm just going to quickly show you how to save settings on a per game basis and how I like to use this function. I'm just going to use Fighting Vipers 2 as an example, and following these instructions here we need to put the ROM name inside squared brackets. So that's FVIPERS for that game. There we go. So for this one, we need to make sure that the Legacy Sound DSP is active as per the UNI file here. So I'm just going to copy this out of there, paste it in there, and just activate it by putting a 1 there. So because this is deactivated by default, it will only be active for Fighting Vipers 2. So say for instance I wanted to change the music volume. I would literally just copy and paste that out of there, and then just change that accordingly. So if I wanted that just to be at default at 100, I'd leave it there. And if I wanted the sound volume to be a little bit lower for that one, for example, I'll just paste that in there, and then I'll do the same for the balance if needed. Another example of how I like to use this function, because I like to have my widescreen and wide background active by default, I'm just going to change those now. I will just deactivate it for the two games it doesn't work very well with. For example, Bass DX. There we go. So that's Sega Bass Fishing. So what I'll do is just copy the widescreen out of there, paste it in there and deactivate it by putting a 0 there. And if you're doing this, you also want to make sure that you deactivate the wide background. So I'm just going to copy that out of there, put that in there and change the 1 to a 0. And then obviously I'd always make sure that I save it. So there we go. The widescreen hack will be active for all other games apart from Bass DX. Before I close out this video, I really just want to double down on how important your ini file is. Having a neat and tidy ini file with all of your settings exactly how you want them, and more importantly your controls exactly how you want them, is imperative to how much you're going to actually enjoy Supermodel. On top of that, making sure that you get all of your per game settings all set up correctly is the icing on the cake. You may have noticed that I did not go over the network functionality in this tutorial. This is because this is more for authentic arcade setups and multi-screen setups. So for games like Daytona USA 2, where you used to be able to link multiple machines in the arcade, you can actually do that with multiple iterations of Supermodel and multiple screens, either on one machine or via a LAN. The setup for this is actually completely different and needs a video in its own right, which it already has, and I'll put a link for those in the description below. So there we have it. That's how to set up the Supermodel emulator for use with a controller and a mouse. I think I managed to catch absolutely everything to get all of these games up and running with no issue. If I have missed something, just drop a comment below. And if you want to do all of that good stuff, drop me a like, subscribe, hit the bell. And if you want to keep this kind of content rolling out, please consider my Patreon. Adios.